Hey, good evening. Hope you're doing well. Today we're learning Maseches Chullin, Daf Chav Hey. We're starting at the Mishnah toward the bottom of Chav Daled on the base, and we'll get to the Mishnah on Chav Hey on the base. Today's block's relatively short. We do have some upcoming larger block that we're gonna have to push through. So Amir Tashem will get some good learning done over the course of the coming couple of weeks. Let us jump right in. Hatahor bekli cheres, that which is tahor by an earthenware vessel, is tamei b'chol hakelim, and we'll analyze this in the Mishnah. Of course, as you can tell from the last many Mishnahs, this is our pattern. What's true over here is not true over there, and vice versa. So here's the vice versa. Tahor b'chol hakelim, that which is pure, which is not problematic by non-earthenware kelim, are tamei b'kli cheres. They will be tamei in a similar case of kli cheres. So says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon, Avir Kli Cheres Tame V'Gabotar. This is the quirk that we all know about Cheres, which is that if there's Tuma that enters the airspace, the open airspace of a Kli Cheres, so then it becomes Tame. However, V'Gabo, if something touches the outside of that Kli, so then that's Tahor. But the exact opposite is true of non-earthenware vessels, 10 lines from the bottom. Avir kol hakelim tahor v'gabon tameh. If something enters the airspace of a non-cheres kli, so then that's not metame anything. That's exeris hakasuv only by cheres, which we'll see soon. But v'gabon tameh. But if something in fact does touch the outside of a non-earthenware kli, the halacha is, of course, that it would be tameh nim. So what's the outcome of these halachos? The outcome of these halachos is what we saw in our Mishnah. Tahor b'kli cheres tameh b'chol hakelim. That which is tahor in a kli cheres, namely, if tuma touches the outside of an earthenware vessel, then that would be tahor. But the same exact act is tameh b'chol hakelim, and vice versa is also true. Tahor b'chol hakelim, which is something entering the airspace of a kli, it would still be tahor. So that would be tameh b'kli cheres. So that's what the Mishnah and Brisa, which fills in the gaps of the Mishnah, teaches us. Says the Gemara, important Mar Mekomos for Shas Yediyah, says the Gemara, Minani Mili. How do we know these halachos to be true, that when something enters the airspace of Kli Cheres, that it becomes Tames? It says the Gemara, the Tanu Rabbanon Tocho. Let's take a look at the pasuk on the side. This pasuk is from Vayikra Yud Aleph, V'chol Kli Cheres, Asher Yipol Mehem El Tocho. If you're dealing with an earthenware vessel and something tameh falls into the airspace, we'll soon see, even if it doesn't touch the walls of the airspace, it literally just hung. It literally just hung inside the airspace. If this is going to be kli cheres and the airpods are tameh, so even without touching the walls, it would be tameh. Masha enkein, if the same exact thing happened in a non-earthenware vessel, tahor. So that's what the Gemara says. So that's based on the pasuk of Tocho ve'afal pi shelo naga. Even if it's true that the tuma, which was hung in the airspace of the kli cheres, even if it never touched the walls of the kli cheres, the halacha is that the kli cheres would become tamei. So says the Gemara, the Brisa. Let's push. Ata omer afal pi shelo naga. You want to argue that maybe that's because that maybe it's even tamei even if the tuma doesn't touch the walls. Oh, enu ella im kein naga. Maybe I should be concerned that it would be tamei only if it touched the walls. How do you know? This is really what the Gemara is asking. By the kli cheres, when we say that the tuma hangs in the airspace and the kli is tamei, how do you know that it didn't touch the walls? Maybe it did. Maybe the only way it would become tamei is if it touches the walls. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yonasan ben Avtulmus Omer. He says, Ne'emar tocho litame, v'ne'emar tocho litame. We have the word tocho for making other things tamei, and we have the word tocho for litame, which is the extra yud means to make itself tamei. Ma tocho ha'amar litame, afal pi shelo naga. That when it comes to tocho in regards to making other things tamei, it would be true even if it didn't touch. Af tocho then itself too. Af tocho amar litame afal pi shelo naga. So that's a drush of the Gemara that indicates to us that the negia on the side of the walls of the tuma entering into the space of the kli cheres, the Gemara says that is not a requirement to generate tuma. Tuma in a kli cheres is generated simply by tuma entering the airspace, even if it never touched it at all, then the kli becomes instantly tamei. Says the Gemara, v'hasam in alan. Your answer had an assumption when it said that tofu it makes itself tamei, that it's going to become tamei even without touching. V'hasam in alan. Where did you get that Mari Makom from? You made a comparison of tofu, but that's it. But you didn't teach us how you know that. So Amar Rabbi Yonasan Torah either al kli cheres. The Torah teaches us that it's going to be kli cheres. What's the edus of the Torah? The last Rashi on the page on Chaf Daled Amud Beis. Techsiv kol asher besocho. The last word is yitma. So the Torah was made that it's only true by a kli cheres that when something hangs in the airspace that it's metame. And the Gemara says that every single thing in there will become tameh, even turning to the top of Chav Hamid Aleph, ve'afilu melochardal, even if it's filled with mustard seeds. What's unique about mustard seeds is that they're relatively small, a few millimeters in diameter, I presume, approximately, give or take. Mustard seeds are not, maybe less actually, they're smaller.
Probably 1 or 2 millimeters.
They're smaller, right?
Yes.
Thinking of peppercorns for some reason, which are a little bit bigger. So what happens when you have 1,000 ichves, 1,000 of them in a kli? Only some of them are touching the outer walls, but everything becomes tamei. So what does that show you? Even if nothing is touching the walls, if it's in the airspace and tuma enters the airspace, it becomes tamei. That's the example of the Gemara. So now what we're going to do is throw a flurry of questions at what we've learned. Says the Gemara on the top of Chaf Hamid Aleph, Amar le Rav Ada bar Abba le Rava. He says to Rava, hold on 1 second, I don't understand something. Maybe we should say, V'hei kli cheres mitame migabo mikal v'chomer. It's good to know grammar here. I don't know grammar that well, but when it says mitame, it means that it should become tame, not make something else tame. So maybe we should say against what we just learned. We said in our Mishnah and the Mari Makomos that we just learned that by a kli cheres, when tuma enters into the airspace, it becomes tame, but it doesn't become tame by contact from the outside. So the Gemara says that Rav Ada bar Abba is pushing on that. Perhaps v'hei kli cheres mitame migabo. Maybe we should say, based on a kal v'chomer, that the outside of a kli cheres can become tamei from physical contact or from exposure. How so? Mikal v'chomer as follows. Uma kol hakelim, with non-earthenware vessels, metal, plastic, with those kelim, she'ein mitamon me aviran. Those don't become tamei in the airspace, right? So if I have, this is actually a plastic cup. I used it as a mashal before, but let's say with a plastic cup, I do this with tuma. What's the halacha? Nothing. Nothing. That's a din by kli cheres. So if by kol hakelim, third line on Chaf Hamid Aleph, we say she'ein mitamen me'aviran, but nevertheless mitamen migabon. If by kol hakelim there's no tumah in the airspace, but if they're touched on the outside, they will become puzzle. Then kli cheres shemitame me'aviro. Then a kli cheres which does become tamei in its airspace, eino din sheyitame migabo. These are difficult Gemaras because what's kal and what's chamor? To make a kal v'chomer, these are a little bit difficult. We're going to invert this in a minute, so it's not so pashut. So it says the Gemara, nevertheless, it's still worthy of a pasuk to try and reject this. How do we know that this kal v'chomer is not true? Namely, how do we know that a kli cheres cannot become tamei by contact on the outside, migabo? Amar kra b'chol kli pasuach asher ein samid psil alav. Ezehu kli shetum aso kodemis lepischo. What type of kli are we talking about where the tuma takes effect if the kli is open? Have omer za kli cheres. V'chi ein samid psil alav hu detame. When there is no cover on it, then it is tamei. Hayesh samid psil alav. If it is covered, then tahor. So therefore, the Gemara says that we see these dinim are very clear by a kli cheres, and they don't apply by kol hakelim, by non-kli cheres. And therefore, that's the Gemara's answer why the kal v'chomer does not apply. Question number 2, 10 lines down on Chaf Hamid Aleph, the Gemara says, wait, why don't we say the exact opposite kal v'chomer? V'hu kol hakelim mitamen me'aviran. Maybe we should say that even a plastic cup, even a glass cup, even a metal cup should become tamei from tuma that's in the avir, in the airspace of the kli. Mikal v'chomer, from the following kal v'chomer. Uma kli cheres. When it comes to an earthenware vessel, she'ein mitame migabo, mitame me'aviro. A kli cheres does not become tamei with contact from the outside, but it does become tamei with tuma being in the airspace. If that's true, then kol hakelim. Then when we talk about non-earthenware vessels, shemitamon migabon, that do become tame from the outside, eino din shemitamen me'aviron. Maybe we should say by kol hakelim that there is tuma in the airspace. Omar Kra, no. Tocho. Tocho shel zeh. Only in the airspace of a kli cheres do we have tuma. V'lo tocho shel acher. However, no other materials of kli have this din. It is only a kli cheres that has tuma inside the airspace, and that's based on a drasha. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. If you'll recall and just scan back to the bottom of Chav Dalet and base 4 lines down, we already used the word tocho. We used it to talk about how we know that there's tuma in a kli cheres even without touching the walls. So says the Gemara, V'hani tocho hadar shinhu. We already used it on the bottom of Chav Dalet. You can't use the same pasuk twice. So it says the Gemara, what should we do now? After all, tocho has been used already. You can't use it to teach me the first din, which is to say that a kli cheres will become tameh in its airspace, even only in airspace without contact. And you can't use it here to say, to reject the kal v'chomer, that perhaps kol hakelim should be metame like kli cheres and its avir. Says the Gemara, don't worry. Here is why we don't have a problem with the word tocho having been used. Arba'a tocho ksive. There really are 4 tochos that are in the pasuk. It's actually not true. If you look in the pasuk on the side, it will say v'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho kol asher besocho yitma v'oso sishboru. The pasuk only has 2. So says the Gemara, look inside, tocho toch and tocho toch. Neither of the words needed to be plural. Both of them could have read perfectly fine. Look at the pasuk. V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el toch hakli, right? Whatever the doesn't have to be tocho. El tocho into its airspace. It's true. So really, what this bothers me. It bothers me. But the only way to have worked. No, it's not my thing either. But I the only thing I could think of is that it could have said el toch hakli instead of el tocho. It doesn't say hatoch. Also doesn't say hatoch. So the Gemara takes this we have to take it at face value that this is what the Gemara means, and it could be that I'm right. I don't know that it could have said el toch hakli. How would we have understood it? V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el toch. That would not have worked for us. It wouldn't have worked. El toch hakli. El tocho is reasonable. Yeah, I hear you more than I hear me. That's for sure. But this actually we learned already. That we learned this in Zvachim. We saw this Gemara already once before. That arba'a tocho ksivi. Either way, the Gemara assumes that there are therefore 4 words to darshan from. Chad legufe. One is to teach us that, in fact, the contents of the kli are tameh. V'chad legzeira shava, to teach us even the airspace, which is what we learned at the bottom of Chav Dalet Amud Beis from the 2 tochos. We said tocho letame and tocho litame. V'chad, that tocho shel zeh v'lo tocho shel acher. That was what we just learned now. That you might, because the question of the Gemara 10 lines down was maybe by non-earthenware kalim, we should say it's mitame be'aviran. So one of the 4 tochs is used for that. And the last one is the most complicated. V'chad tocho v'lo toch tocho ve'afilu kli shetef. Is that, let's say I had a kli within another kli, just like this. Let's say it fit a little bit more, and the inner kli was taller. So then the impact of the outer kli is nothing on the inner kli. That's the case of kli shetef. There's a beautiful Rashi here, not so complicated, but lengthy. And we're not going to read it, but it's great for you to read if you want to really get all the details. But the basic point is that if the inner kli is taller than the outer kli, so then the inner kli will not become tameh even if the outer kli does. Third question on what we've learned. Says the Gemara, a third of the way down, V'lo yuhu kol hakelim mitamen migabon. Maybe we should say that when it comes to kol hakelim, to non-earthenware kalim, that they do become tameh migabon that they don't become tameh on the outside at all, Ella, the only time that a non-earthenware kli could become tameh is mitochan uvenegia, is if the tuma was inside the kli and it touched the inner walls of the kli. Mikal v'chomer. Uma klei cheres shemitame me'aviro. Here's the kal v'chomer that I might have thought about non-earthenware kalim, that they can't become tameh on the outside, only on the inside with negia. Uma kli cheres, when it comes to non-earthenware kalim, shemitame me'aviro, eino mitame migabo, that a kli cheres, which does become tameh in its airspace, even without touching, but it doesn't become tameh on the outside. But in contrast, kol hakelim, when it comes to non-earthenware vessels, she'ein mitamen me'aviran, that don't become tameh in the airspace, eino din she'ein mitamen migabon, then maybe we should say that they don't become tameh on the outside at all. They only become tameh on the inside and with physical contact of the inner wall. Says the Gemara, no. Amar kra v'chol kli pasuach asher ein samid psilalav tamehu. Hi, hu dechi ein samid psilalav tameh. Hi, only referring to klei cheres. That's when we say that if there's no seal, it will become tameh. This is talking about tumas ohel more technically, that if there's a mace in the house and there's a kli cheres and it's not sealed, then it will become tameh. However, in regards to kli cheres, hayesh samid psilalav then tahor. Now, what is excluded from all of this? Hakol hakelim, bein sheyesh samid psil aleihem, bein she'ein samid psil aleihem, mitamen from the outside. There's no way to avoid that. Whether or not they have a seal on the top, they're going to become tameh on the outside, but not on the inside. So we've gone through all of these permutations and questions that the Gemara presented. We thought perhaps that maybe we should say that a kli cheres should become tameh from the outside. We rejected that with the pasuk of chol kli pasuach. We thought perhaps that non-earthenware vessels would become tameh in their airspace. We rejected that from toch tocho toch tocho. Then we said, well, maybe in regards to kol hakelim, to non-earthenware vessels, that the only time they become tameh is not on the outside, but only on the inside with physical contact. The Gemara rejected that with v'chol kli pasuach asher ein samid psil alav. That leaves us with where we started, that there is a unique quirk about the world of cheres. Cheres cannot become tameh from the outside. It can only become tameh on the inside, and even if it doesn't touch the inner wall. Masha'ain came by kol hakelim, which are non-earthenware vessels that will not become tameh on the inside unless there's physical contact. That iteration we didn't discuss. If there is physical contact, then yes. But on the outside, it also becomes tameh. So that is how we conclude our Gemara with the uniqueness of klei cheres. Let's now talk about kalim of different materials that are not klei cheres. We're going to talk about klei eitz, and we're going to talk about klei matachos, wood and metal. And here the Gemara, following its template for the last many blot, does the same exact thing that it's done over the last many blot. The bottom of Chav Hey Amud Aleph, 15 lines or so from the bottom of a new Mishnah. In a case where there's tahor b'kli eitz, where there's a kli eitz that, and in this case, tahor means that it's not susceptible to tuma. We're talking about the development of a kli. In a case of wood, where it is not susceptible to tuma, in that same case, it will be tameh b'kli matachos. Then in a kli matachos that's made out of metal, so that would be susceptible to tuma. But the opposite, if you have a case of tahor b'kli matachos, if you have a case of metal which is not susceptible to tuma, that exact case would be tameh b'kli eitz in regards to wood. So what we're going to do now is, as we've done prior, is pick apart our Mishnah by bringing another brisa that has more color and more detail in it than our Mishnah. Says the Gemara at the open of the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, Golme klei eitz. If you have golme, which is unfinished wood, golme klei eitz, an unfinished piece of wood, but it is still somewhat usable. So says the Gemara, Tmein. If they're still somewhat functional, even if they're not totally finished, so the halacha is that they are susceptible to tuma. Pshutehen, if I had a piece of wood that was a pashut, it was a completely flat piece of wood. You know, when you go to Home Depot or to Lowe's and you buy paint, they sell these flat wooden sticks that are paint stirrers. That is a quintessential example of pshutei kli eitz. There's no curvature, there's no base kibul, it's just a flat piece of wood. A slab, a challah board, right? Those are slabs. So those are pshutei kli eitz. If you have a piece of wood that's pshutei and they have no base kibul, there's no indentations, there's nothing carved out, there's no shapes in them tahorin, they are not eligible to become tameh. All of that is in regards, as the Brisa says, to unfinished wooden products and unfinished metal products. Vigolme clay matachos are tahorin. If you have an unfinished piece of metal, that's going to stay tahor. We're going to ask on the next amud why it is that we distinguish this way. And pshutei, and if I have a flat piece of metal, well, that is tameh. The exact opposite. Nimtza, same format as we've seen. What do we now see? A verification of what we've learned in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Nimtza tahor bechli eitz, tameh bechli matachos. That which in a case of wood, the kli would not be susceptible to tuma, it's tahor. We would say that by a metal kli it is tameh. And tahor b'kli matachos, that which is by a metal kli which is not susceptible to tuma would be tameh by a kli. So those were the reverse cases. We said that in a case of unfinished wood, it's going to be tameh, but with flat wood, it would be tahor. And then we said the exact opposite, that with unfinished metal, it would be tar, but with pshute matachos, it would be tameh. We're going to ask why later. So it says the Gemara, what are examples of each of these things? And for this, we're going to need some definitions. I'll rattle through them pretty quickly. The eluhain golme clay eitz. What are types of wood that are not yet complete, that, as we saw in the open of the Gemara, that would be susceptible to tuma? So it says the Gemara, kol she'asid lashuf, if you have something that you're soon going to polish, or l'shabetz, you're going to add stones or gems, l'garer, you're going to smooth them out with a plane, l'charkev, you're going to add grooves, lehatiach betunas, you're going to use some type of sandpaper to shave it down. And one of the things we've seen earlier in Shas, that they did this with the scales of a fish. They didn't have sandpaper like we do at Lowe's with different, 220. They didn't have, of course, they didn't have these technologies, obviously. Or if it was mechusar khan, if it was missing a base, ogen, if it was missing a lip or a lid, ozen, or if it was missing a handle. So those are examples of golme clay eitz that are going to be tameh. However, mechusar chatita, if you are missing the hollowing out of the board, meaning up until now it's flat, I do plan to carve out a space. Let's say it's an inch thick, and I plan to create a semicircle that's half an inch thick, like a little divot that's different. That would be tar, because right now it's pshute clay eitz. Mechusar chatita pshita, says the Gemara. If you haven't carved anything out, then it's just pshute clay eitz. Says the Gemara, no. You need to know the shiur. Says the Gemara, lo tzricha de chak kipiza bekaba. You only did a kipiza bekaba. You only did a small amount, a little divot, instead of the full kab. It's just a percentage of a kab. All of that are the examples of golme clay eitz, with the exception of mechusar chatita, which is going to be tahor. And on the last line of Kaf Hamad Aleph, the Gemara says, "Ve'eluhain golme clay matachos." Here are examples of incomplete pieces of metal, and as we learned in our Mishnah, these incomplete pieces of metal were tahor. They were not susceptible to tumah. We'll soon see it's because of their chashivus. So says the Gemara, kol she'asid lashuf, same as before, something that you later plan to polish, or l'shabetz, you plan to add gems, or l'garer, you plan to add grooves, or l'charkev. L'charkev, what was that one? That was to plane. Other way around. Oh, thank you very much. So that means that l'garer is what? Is to plane, and l'charkev is to add grooves, even though the language is l'charker. If you look on the side, it corrects it to l'charkev. Lahakish bekurnas, you're going to hit it with some type of hammer or anvil. Mechusar khan, if it's missing its base. O ogen, if it's missing its lip or lid. O ozen, it's missing its handle. In all of those cases, the incomplete metal is going to be tahor. Mechusar kisui, if all that's missing is the cover, meaning the kli itself is finished, but it's missing its cover, thinking of like a pot in which you'd use noodles, those are tameh. So now the Gemara wants to know, thank you very much. You've given me clarity. There are all these examples of wood that are incomplete, that are tameh. all these examples of metal that are incomplete, that are tahor. But why is it that by the wood, when it's incomplete, it's still tameh, and by the metal, when it's incomplete, it's still tar? Says the Gemara, Maishna hani, umaishna hani, Rashi, Maishna, 9, 10 lines down, Maishna gulmi claim atachos titahorin, umaishna shel eitz titmein. They're both equally unprepared and unfinished. So why is it that when it comes to wood, it's considered tame, susceptible to tuma, yet by mateches, with the same exact limitations, again, l'shabe, it's all the same limiters. We said that by the mateches, that the halacha was different. We said that it's not shaykh, that it's not susceptible to tuma. So here we see two answers. Rav Yochanan Omar Hoel ulechavod asuyan. Because metal is made to be used for kavod, so then it's a pchisas kavod, that it's an incomplete vessel. Could you imagine? You go to the store, you go to like Trendy Table, wherever you go, you buy a metal kli, and it's not done yet. You know what you do with it? You return it. Something's wrong. That's not a functional kli. That's not the makeh bepatish kli that is considered. So therefore, it's not susceptible to tuma. It's not yet at the level of kli. Masha Kain, when it comes to wood, see, again, we're not used to this. We would return the wood one to in our era, but in their era, oh, no problem. I'll shave it out later. They were more willing to work with it, so that means it's done enough, and therefore it's going to be tamid. Rav Nachman gives a somewhat similar answer. Rav Nachman Amar, Holud mehen yakarim, because they're expensive. So therefore, wood's not expensive. Metal, processing metal in that day, very expensive. If you've ever watched how we make, metal products now, you got a company, they build a machine, you run metal through the machine. It done. Takes 2 seconds. Nobody had to hammer anything. It's just done. It's just done. Make a hinge in under 5 seconds with this. Okay, you have to spend money to make the templating. I understand, but the actual processing by us is super fast. By them, holud man yukarin, it must be that it's not yet done. If the item was expensive but unfinished. No. So says the Gemara, what we should be thinking, my beinayu.
Just think of the concept, the word makin b'padosh, right? Familiar with that? Translate the words. Hit it with a hammer. It's missing one thing. I don't know what that does.
It's not done yet. Without the hammer, it's not
the
done.
hammer. I'm in trouble, but it's not done until they hit it with the hammer.
Which doesn't apply to wood. We brought in makeh b'patish halachically. When we use it in halacha, it means that which makes it functional and final. But the words, yeah, 100%.
What it is, it makes it final.
Yeah.
Because it hits hit with
So they both agree to the conclusion that metal is different than wood, and metal, it's not susceptible to tuma because, again, either because it's lechavod asuyan and it's not done yet, or because it's expensive, and who buys a broken, expensive thing? That's not normal. That's not normal. So now the Gemara is bothered. My beinayu, why did Rav Yochanan want to say holu lechavod asuyan, and why did Rav Nachman say holu dmein yukarin? What's the difference between them? So, the Gemara is so dark. The Gemara says because there's another material that we didn't discuss yet. Ike beinayu clay etzem, a vessel that's made out of bone. Okay, obviously.
Did Jews do that?
Not out of people. That would be problematic for a Kohen. Animal bones. There's no tumas mace unless it's a sheretz, but there's no tumas mace by a regular animal. So let's talk about making this up. I've never made anything from an animal other than steak. But let's say I took the femur of a cow, which I have a feeling is significant, and I used it as a shower rod, or I used it as a baseball bat, or whatever. I have no idea. So what about clay etzem? That would be the difference between them, because according to the Meforshim here, when we talk about bone, it's expensive but not chashuv. So if it's expensive, so then according to Rav Nachman, ho'olut mehen yikarin, only if it's fully finished bone would it be worthwhile, a kli made out of bone. Masha ein kain, because it's not chashuv, Rav Yochanan would say, yeah, that's not a problem. Who cares if it's finished? Who cares if it's not finished? It will be tahor just like the wood. It'll be tamei just like the wood. So according to Rav Nachman, bone is in the category of metal, and according to Rav Yochanan, bone is in the category of wood. And this is the distinction between them. The Rav Nachman, the timing. Rav Nachman, who holds that bone is chashuv, holds this way. The Amar Rav Nachman, kli etzem ki kli matachosam. Oh, beautiful. We see black on white that Rav Nachman holds that kli etzem has the same exact din as metal, which means that until it's a final product, it is going to remain tahor, it'll remain unsusceptible to tumah. Says the Gemara, this implies tuma. Well, if you're saying that at some point a kli etzem could be a final kli, according to Rav Yochanan, even if it's missing one of these steps, it's going to be like wood. Or according to Rav Nachman, once it's mamish fully done. One way or the other, doesn't that imply that if I use a part of the skeleton of a behemoth, doesn't that imply that there will be tumah? Says the Gemara, yes, you could be metame that kli. How do we know? The Tanya, Rabbi Shmuel, Benosha Rav Yochanan ben Broka Omer, Ma Talmud Lomar b'chol Maise Izim Tischato, that everything from the Izim needs to be Tischato, needs to have Tahara. Lahavi Davar Abamina Izim. This comes to include something from Izim that will be susceptible to Tumah, that can become Tischato, that can become Tor. Min HaKarnayim, from the horns, which are made out of bone. Uminat tlafim, and from the hooves, which are made out of bone. So we see, obviously, that there still is a din of tumah, because the Chumash tells us that v'chol ma'is ism tischato. The tischato is a process of tara, implying what are you matayr? That which is tameh. How do you do that? So I take the hoof of the animal, I take the horn, I make it into a shofar, I make it into a kli. That's a kli. That's a kli, and it can become tameh. Sha'ar behema b'chaya minayin. How do we know that this din applies? That the bones of other animals are also going to become tamei. Talmud lomar v'chol ma'aseh. That was just going back to the same pasuk. Im kain ma Talmud lomar izim. If all animals are this way, why did you bother to specify any animal? Just say v'chol ma'aseh of any animal. Says the Gemara, because prat le'ofos. Let's say you take the largest kosher bird you can, you take the femur, you make it into a kli, whatever. No. There's no tumah by the skeletal structure. I don't know if chickens have like bones or they're like more cartilagey bones. I don't know, but it doesn't matter. The distinction of the Gemara is that if we're dealing with a kosher behemoth, we're dealing with any behemoth, I guess, then once you make it into a kli, either according to the standard of Rabbi Yochanan or of Nachman, whichever, that we are susceptible to tumah.
Legs, bones.
Yeah. I wonder what they're like when they're uncooked. I have no idea. I presume you're right. I don't know. Do they harden? I think you're right. I don't know. I don't know why I feel like they're. You're correct. Oh, then you're right. That's true. I've cooked them before. Right. Yeah, they're hard. Yeah, they're hard. They're hard. Yeah, I think so. I've seen the drumsticks before. Yeah. Good. Let's talk about almonds, says the Gemara, 1/3 of the way down, and then we'll stop at the next Mishnah. Hachai b'shkedim hamarim. There's different types of almonds. Some are bitter and edible. Some are sweet and edible, and they're mutually exclusive. That which is chayiv, at the stage at which shkedim are marim, are pater b'mesukim. Then in the same stage, a sweet one would be aser. Hachai b'mesukim, at the stage where there would be meiser by almonds that are sweet, then potter b'marim. And again, same template, says the Gemara, just about halfway down Tana Rabbanan. Shkedim hamarim, when we deal with almonds that are bitter, ktanim chayavim, the small ones are the ones that are chayav in meiser, and gedolim pturim, but the large shkedim that are bitter are potter. Misukim are the exact opposite. If you have sweet ones, then gedolim chayavim and ktanim pturim. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi argues, Omer Mishum Aviv, Ze v'ze pater. All of them are going to be pater, namely that there's no chiyuv of meiser no matter the size. The Amri la ze v'ze l'chiyuv. Oh, so that's a problem. That's a pretty concerning mistake that we don't know what's what. Amar Rabbi Ilah, Hora Reb Chanina b'tzipora kediv Amar ze v'ze pater, that he paskened that really it's ze v'ze pater. This is the one that's quoted by the Rambam in Hilchos Meiser, that you'd be pater from shkedim at any level. According to the Shita that says that really you'd be chayiv at both stages of the almond's development. Gedolim namai chazu. What were they usable for? They were so bitter. What would a gadol mar shake taste like? Well, that's not edible. Says the Gemara, and this is how we eat them. Rabbi Yochanan, hol v'yachol lematkan al yedei ha'or. Roast them. It'll be great. Just roast them. We'll get the sweetness out. So that would be the distinction over here in our Gemara. The machlokes tanaim, and one of the shitas doesn't make it into our Mishnah because our Mishnah doesn't reference the shita Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi in the name of his father of Rabbi Shmuel. But nevertheless, that is a shita found over here, and it makes it in Shulchan Aruch, and it's missing from our Mishnah. So our Mishnah just talks about the mutually exclusive bitter and sweet almonds, and it seems to be that we don't hold that way. We hold that they're completely pater, and this Mishnah is not lehalacha. We'll stop right here by the Mishnah about Hatemed, 2/3 of the way down. And Mirza Hashem, we'll be back together tomorrow night for another daf. Wishing you all a beautiful night.